I married him for money. I want you to know that up front. $400,000 in debt. My mother in a hospital bed. And a man I had met exactly twice, sitting across from me at a courthouse, waiting for me to say I do. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I'd find a way out. That first night, at 2 in the morning, I packed my bag. I was going to leave. And then I looked through a door I shouldn't have opened. What I saw on the other side changed everything I thought I knew about strength, about what love actually looks like when nobody's watching. My name is Claire Hartley, and I want to start by telling you something I'm not proud of. I married a man I didn't love. I married him for money. Not because I was greedy. God knows I had never been the kind of woman who chased after wealth. I married him because my mother was dying, and I was 28 years old, and I was completely, utterly out of options. I want you to understand who I was before any of this happened, because it matters to the story. I grew up in a small town outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, the kind of place where everybody knows your family name and what your daddy does for a living. My daddy drove a delivery truck. My mama worked the register at the drugstore on Main Street. We weren't poor, exactly. We just never had much left over at the end of the month. I learned early on that money was something you worried about quietly and never talked about at the dinner table. I'd moved to Charlotte when I was 22, rented a room with 2 other girls, and found work at a hair salon not as a stylist, just an assistant, washing hair, sweeping floors, scheduling appointments, making coffee. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid my rent and let me send a little home to my mother every month. That felt like enough. I was young. I figured the rest of life would sort itself out eventually. Then Mama collapsed on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I got the call at the salon. She'd been at the grocery store, just reaching for a can of soup, and she went down like a light had been switched off. The paramedics said it was a hemorrhagic stroke bleeding in the brain. Surgery was required immediately. No waiting, no second opinions, no time to figure out the finances. The surgery alone cost more than $20,000. And when Mama finally woke up, when she could finally speak again and squeeze my hand and look at me with those soft brown eyes of hers, she told me something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor of that hospital room. She had co-signed loans, 3 of them, for friends who'd fallen on hard times. She had never told me, never told anyone, because that was her nature, generous and private, and never wanting to make a fuss. The friends couldn't pay. The debt had compounded. Between the hospital bills and what she'd guaranteed for others, the number came out to a little over $400,000. I sat in that plastic hospital chair, and I held her hand, and she kept saying, "Claire, honey, I'm so sorry. I'm so, so sorry." And I kept saying, "Mama, it's fine. We'll figure it out." And I had absolutely no idea how. The bank wouldn't give me a loan on my salary. Credit cards would have taken a lifetime to pay off at those interest rates. I was looking at the kind of hole that swallows people whole, the kind that follows you for 30 years. That's when my salon manager, a kind woman named Beverly, sat me down after closing one evening and told me she knew someone who might be able to help. His name, she said, was Marcus Webb. He was 35 years old. He lived in a house his mother had left him on the east side of Charlotte, and he had a rare neuromuscular condition, the kind that had progressively taken the use of his legs, leaving him dependent on a wheelchair for most movement. His father, she explained, was a man named Robert Webb, who ran a small but profitable civil engineering firm. Robert was looking for a companion for his son, not a nurse, not a caretaker, a wife. I thought Beverly had lost her mind. I remember sitting across from her in that empty salon, the chairs all draped in their little capes for the night, and thinking people don't do things like that. That's something out of an old movie, a different century. But Mama's hospital bill was sitting in my purse, and the notices from the debt collectors had already started. I met Robert Webb a week later at a diner near his office. He was a big man, tall, weathered face, the kind of hands that have done real physical work for decades. He stirred his coffee slowly and looked at me across the table with an expression that was not unkind, exactly, but was very businesslike. "The arrangement is simple," he said. "You marry my son. You live with him. You treat him like a real husband, not a patient, and I will clear every dollar of your mother's debt." He paused and added, "I mean a real marriage, not just on paper. I want Marcus to have a partner, someone who eats dinner with him and watches television and talks to him like he's a person." That last part stopped me. I would think about it later. The way he said it, like his son's greatest need, was simply to be treated like a person. Said something about what Marcus's life must have been like up until then. I said I needed a few days to think about it. I spent those days looking at my mother's face and the pile of bills on her nightstand, and the way she flinched every time a nurse came in, worried about what each visit was adding to the total. I called Robert Webb on a Thursday morning. "I'll do it," I said. I met Marcus for the first time 4 days before the wedding. We sat in a coffee shop near his house. He arrived in a wheelchair, and even seated, you could tell he was tall. His face was sharper than I'd expected, more defined. He wore a dark button-down shirt, and his hair was neatly cut. He looked, honestly, like someone who took care of himself. He also barely spoke. We sat for almost an hour. He answered my questions in 2 or 3 words. He didn't ask me very much. At the end, he looked at me steadily and said, "If you're agreeable, we can file the paperwork Monday." His voice was low and clear and completely flat. "All right," I said. What else was there to say? The wedding was the smallest thing you've ever seen. A courthouse ceremony with a handful of witnesses, Robert and Marcus's aunt, Patricia, on his side Beverly, and a coworker from the salon on mine. My mother was still in the hospital and couldn't attend. That was the part that hurt the most, honestly. Not the ceremony itself, just that Mama wasn't there. Marcus sat in his wheelchair throughout. He didn't look at me much. When the judge asked him to place the ring on my finger, he did it with the careful, deliberate motion of someone performing a task he has practiced. His hands were warm. I noticed that even then. Afterward, we drove to the house. His house, now technically ours. It was a 2-story brick colonial in an older neighborhood, the kind of street where the houses have good bones, but need a little love. The yard had gone a bit wild. Paint was peeling at the eaves. Inside, the hardwood floors creaked in the hallway, and the wallpaper in the front room had started to peel at the corners. Marcus showed me to a bedroom on the 2nd floor. Small, clean, with a window that looked out over the backyard. "This one's yours," he said. "I'm downstairs. The house is yours to use however you'd like. The kitchen is stocked. Help yourself to whatever's there." He paused at his own door. "Make yourself comfortable, Claire." Then he went inside and closed the door. I sat on the edge of that bed in the quiet of that old house, listening to the central air hum and a dog bark somewhere down the block, and I thought, what on earth have I done? It was 11 o'clock at night. I had a husband I'd met twice. My mother was in a hospital room 2 miles away, and I had absolutely no idea what came next. I lay down on top of the covers, still in my dress. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. Around 2 in the morning, I made a decision. I was going to leave. Not forever, just temporarily. I would go back to my apartment, sleep in my own bed, and figure out some other way to solve the money problem. Beverly would understand. Maybe Robert Webb would understand. Maybe I could negotiate some other arrangement. Because this silent house with this silent man, this wasn't something I could do. I got up. Quietly, I found my overnight bag and put a few things into it. I slipped off my shoes and carried them so the heels wouldn't click on the hardwood. I made it all the way to the bottom of the stairs before I heard it. A sound from behind Marcus's door. A low, strained sound. Like effort. Like someone working hard at something in the dark. I stopped walking. For a moment I thought he might be in pain, the kind of pain that requires help. I set my bag down and moved toward the door. I told myself I was just going to check. Just make sure he was all right. The door wasn't fully latched. Through the gap, in the light from his bedside lamp, I could see him. Marcus was on the floor, face down, doing push-ups. Not assisted push-ups. Not modified push-ups. Real ones, arms full extension, back straight. The whole thing, except that from the waist down, he was completely still, his legs contributing nothing. He was lifting his entire body weight on the strength of his arms alone. His jaw was set. Sweat had dampened his hairline. He was counting quietly to himself. 14, 15, 16. He didn't stop. I don't know how long I stood there in that doorway. Long enough to count past 30. Long enough to watch him pause, breathe, and start a second set without complaint. Without anyone watching. Without anyone to tell him he was doing a good job. He was doing this because he had decided to. That was all. Just a man in a dark room, by himself, at 2 a.m, refusing to become less than he intended to be. I picked up my overnight bag. I carried it back upstairs. I put my things away in the dresser, one item at a time. And then I lay down on that bed, and I looked at the ceiling again. But this time, I wasn't thinking about leaving. I was thinking about what it costs a person to fight a battle that never ends, quietly, alone, in the middle of the night. And to do it with the same steadiness every single time. I wasn't going anywhere. The first week was the most awkward thing I have ever lived through. And I grew up with a father who liked to sing loudly and off-key at the dinner table. So my tolerance for awkwardness has always been fairly high. Marcus and I lived in that house like two people orbiting different planets. We were polite, impeccably polite, in the way that strangers are when they're forced to share a space, and neither one wants to be the cause of any difficulty. Good morning. Good evening. Excuse me. Thank you. That was essentially the full vocabulary of our first 7 days. He was up every morning before 6. I'd hear the soft roll of his wheelchair on the hardwood, the sounds of the bathroom, the quiet movement in the kitchen. By the time I came downstairs, he would have already eaten, washed his dishes, and retreated to his room, where the sound of a keyboard told me he was working on something. I never asked what. It felt like asking would be intruding. I ate breakfast alone at the kitchen table, listening to the birds outside, and the distant sound of traffic, and the particular silence of a house that contains 2 people who have nothing to say to each other yet. On the 4th morning, I offered to do his laundry. I'm putting a load in anyway, I said. It's no trouble. He looked at me for a moment, not unkindly, just measuring, and said, I appreciate it, but I take care of my own things. It wasn't rude. It was just a door, gently closed. I noticed other things, though. Small things that accumulated over the first couple of weeks, like deposits in a jar. When I did the dishes and left them in the drying rack, they were always arranged more efficiently the next morning, cups nested together, bowls stacked by size. He'd reorganize them after I'd gone to bed. He never said anything about it. When I left my umbrella by the front door one rainy night, it appeared in the morning on the hook where it could dry properly. He'd moved it. Once I came home from visiting Mama at the hospital, she'd had a hard day, and I could feel the weight of it in my shoulders and my jaw. And when I passed through the kitchen, I found a pot of tea on the stove, still warm, with a mug set out beside it. He had heard me come in. He hadn't said a word. I poured the tea and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time. He never mentioned it. Not the next day, not ever. And I never thanked him directly, because I understood, somehow, that thanking him would embarrass him. That the whole point was the anonymity of it, the help given without the burden of acknowledgement. So I started doing the same thing. I began making 2 portions of dinner instead of 1, leaving his in the oven with a note that said only, "Plate for you, M." He ate it. Every time. I could tell because the plate would be washed and put away in the morning. I kept the floors of the downstairs dry. He'd never asked me to, but I'd seen how carefully he had to maneuver the wheelchair around puddles near the sink, and I understood, without being told, that a wet floor was a hazard he dealt with silently and daily. When he wheeled out to the back porch one Saturday afternoon with a book, I brought 2 glasses of lemonade without asking and set one on the little side table near his chair. I went back inside. 20 minutes later, I peeked through the window. The glass was half empty. That was our whole first month. Small kindnesses, each one anonymous, each one received without comment, like 2 people writing letters to each other in a language that had no words. The first time Marcus fell, I was home. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon. I heard a crash from the living room, a heavy, sudden sound, and I came running to find him on the floor beside his wheelchair, one arm braced under him. The chair had slid sideways on a throw rug he'd apparently misjudged. "Let me help you," I said immediately, and started to kneel beside him. "I'm fine." His voice was calm. "I can do it myself." "Marcus." "Claire." He looked at me steadily from the floor, not in anger, but with something that was very clear and very firm. "I can do it myself. Thank you." So I stood back, and I watched him do it. He repositioned his arms, steadied the wheelchair, and used the strength in his upper body to lift himself from the floor back into the seat in a single controlled movement. The whole thing took about 40 seconds. His expression never changed. When he was seated again, he adjusted his shirt and looked at me. "I fall sometimes," he said, in the same tone he might use to mention the weather. "It happens when I'm transferring. I've gotten used to it. Does it hurt?" He considered the question. "Sometimes. Less than it used to." I sat down in the armchair across from him. I wasn't sure why. I suppose I just didn't want to walk away from a moment where he had, for the first time, told me something real. "How long have you been managing on your own?" I asked. 3 years. Since Mom passed. The house, I now understood, had been his mother's. He'd been living in it alone since she died, or not alone. Exactly, but without anyone who actually knew him, without anyone whose job was simply to be present. "I noticed your hands," I said. "The calluses." He looked at them. "Wheelchair," he said simply. "You should have seen a doctor about that scrape on your arm from just now. It's not worth the copay." I got up, found the first aid kit in the bathroom cabinet. I'd stocked it properly in my first week, because it had been almost empty, and came back. I held out my hand. He looked at it for a moment, then extended his arm. His skin was warm. The calluses were substantial, the kind that come from years of bearing weight. I cleaned the scrape and put a bandage on it without saying anything unnecessary. He watched me work with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not discomfort. Not gratitude exactly. More like someone who is unaccustomed to being tended to and is deciding how to feel about it. "Thank you," he said quietly when I was done. "Of course," I said. We sat there for a little while after that, the rain coming down outside, and for the first time, the silence between us felt less like absence and more like something that might, eventually, become comfortable. That evening I made chili. I made enough for both of us, and I put 2 bowls on the kitchen table. I didn't ask if he wanted to eat together. I just set the table for 2 and went to let him know dinner was ready. He came to the table. We didn't talk much, but we ate in the same room, at the same time, for the first time. And when he finished, he said the food was good. Just that. 3 words. It was the best 3 words I'd heard in weeks. From that point, something between us slowly, carefully began to change. The way a room changes when someone opens a window for the first time after a long winter. Nothing dramatic. No announcements. Just a little more air. A little more light. One evening, he wheeled out to the living room where I was reading and asked, without preamble, whether I had a preference for the thermostat setting. I told him I ran cold. He turned it up 2 degrees and went back to his room. One morning he asked what I liked in my coffee. The next day, there was a new container of half and half in the refrigerator, though we had plenty of whole milk. He remembered. That's the thing I kept noticing. He paid attention, and he remembered, and he acted on what he'd learned without making any kind of production of it. And slowly, without either of us naming it, something that felt like partnership had begun to take shape in that creaky old house on the east side of Charlotte. About 6 weeks into our marriage, on a Saturday afternoon, when the azaleas in the backyard were just starting to bloom, a car pulled up in front of the house that I did not recognize. I was in the kitchen making a grocery list. Marcus was in the living room, reading. I heard the doorbell, and I heard Marcus's wheelchair roll to answer it. And then I heard a woman's voice that immediately made the back of my neck prickle. "Marcus, honey, Aunt Patricia's here." I put down my pen. Patricia Shelton was Robert Webb's younger sister, Marcus's father's sibling. She was somewhere in her late 50s, small and precisely put together, with highlighted hair and jewelry that let you know she took herself seriously. She swept into the house like someone who had never in her life waited to be invited. And when she spotted me in the kitchen doorway, she stopped and gave me the kind of look that takes a woman's entire value and finds it lacking in about 4 seconds. "So this is her," she said. "Not to me. To Marcus." "Aunt Patricia," Marcus said, and his voice had gone careful and flat in a way I hadn't heard before. "You didn't say you were coming. Do I need to call ahead for my own nephew?" She settled herself on the sofa without being asked and set her large handbag on the coffee table like she was staking a claim. "Get your aunt some water, sweetheart." I brought water. I was polite. I told myself this is his family. This is his life. Be gracious. She watched me move around the kitchen with an expression I recognized from a certain type of woman who has decided before she walked in the door that she doesn't like you. "How old are you?" she asked when I sat down. 28. "Where are you from?" "Raleigh, originally. I've been in Charlotte about 6 years." "And what is it you do?" "I work at a salon. I'm a stylist's assistant." She made a small sound that was not quite a word and not quite anything polite. "Well," she said, setting down her water glass, "you're a pretty enough girl. I'll give you that much." The way she said it made it clear that was the only thing she intended to give me. The visit went on for 2 hours. Patricia talked mostly to Marcus about family gossip, about his father, about a cousin who had just had a baby. She largely ignored me, which I tried to experience as a mercy. But then, toward the end, she turned and looked at me directly with an expression I can only describe as the face a person makes right before they say something they know is unkind, and have decided to say anyway. Let me ask you something honestly, sweetheart. She leaned forward. Why exactly did you marry Marcus? The room went quiet. I could feel Marcus watching me. I could feel the weight of the question, and what was underneath it, all the assumptions it carried, all the things she'd already decided were true. Because I wanted to, I said. Is that right? It wasn't a question. A young, healthy, pretty girl decides she wants to marry a man in a wheelchair. Out of the blue. Just like that. Patricia. Marcus's voice had an edge I hadn't heard before. I'm asking because I love you, Marcus. Because your father does things without thinking them through, and someone has to look out for you. She turned back to me. Honey, I don't know what arrangement you've made with Robert, but I know how this looks, and I know what kind of woman does this kind of thing. She left that sentence incomplete. She didn't need to finish it. I know what you think, I said. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be, and I'm not going to pretend the situation is simple, but I am not here to take advantage of anyone. You don't have to say that to me, sweetheart. You have to say it to yourself. She stood up, collected her handbag, and kissed Marcus on the cheek. I'm watching, she told me pleasantly on her way to the door. I just want you to know that. Whatever you're planning to do, I'm watching. The door closed behind her. The house felt very quiet. I was sitting very still in the armchair across from Marcus, my hands folded in my lap, my face completely under control. I had practiced this kind of control my whole life, the ability to sit through something humiliating without letting anyone see how much it had landed. Claire, Marcus's voice was quiet. I'm fine. You don't have to be fine. I looked at him. There was something in his expression I hadn't seen before, not pity, which I would have hated. Something closer to recognition, like he knew what it was to be assessed and found insufficient by someone who hadn't bothered to actually look. She's not wrong that it's a strange situation, I said. She's wrong about you, he said. She decided what you were before you ever walked in the door. That's not judgment. That's convenience. He paused. For what it's worth, he said. I don't think you're here for any reason that should embarrass you. I didn't know what to say to that. I think I just nodded. But that night, lying in my room upstairs, I turned his words over and over. I don't think you're here for any reason that should embarrass you. He wasn't telling me the situation was noble. He was telling me he understood the difference between what a person does in a desperate moment and who a person actually is. That distinction had never been made on my behalf before. Not by anyone. Something shifted in me that night. Quietly, the way the most important shifts always happen. I stopped thinking of Marcus as the man I had agreed to live with. I started thinking of him as someone I wanted to understand. The following week, Patricia called Robert. Robert called Marcus. Robert showed up on a Wednesday evening unannounced, which seemed to be a family pattern, and sat in our living room and told Marcus, in my presence, that he was concerned about the arrangement. Marcus listened to everything his father said. Then he said calmly, Claire is my wife. She lives in my house. She takes care of it and of me, and I trust her. If you have concerns about how I'm running my own life, I'm happy to hear them. But I'm not going to discuss Claire as though she isn't in the room. Robert opened his mouth. Dad. Marcus's voice was very quiet. She's in the room. Robert closed his mouth. He left about 20 minutes later. Marcus wheeled to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water and didn't say anything for a while. Thank you, I finally said. You don't need to thank me for that, he said. That's just basic decency. But I thanked him anyway. Because in my experience, basic decency is rarer than people like to think. And when someone extends it to you cleanly, without drama, without wanting credit, it matters. It matters a great deal. I have to tell you about Ryan. Ryan Calloway was my boyfriend before all of this happened. We'd been together for almost 3 years, from when I was 25 until just before I moved in with Marcus. He was a good-looking man, easy to be around in the uncomplicated way that some people are easy to be around. And I had loved him in that early, uncomplicated way you love someone before life gets complicated. We talked about getting married someday, in the vague way young people do when they're happy and not yet tested. Then, his company relocated him to Denver. We tried the long-distance thing for 4 months. It was nobody's fault, really. Distance has its own gravity. We drifted, and then we separated, and I told myself I was fine. And mostly I was. That was before Mama got sick. Before the debt. Before Marcus. 3 months into my marriage, on a Tuesday afternoon, when the summer heat was sitting on Charlotte like a warm, wet blanket, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, and I almost didn't answer it. But something made me pick up. Claire. His voice hadn't changed at all. I sat down on the back porch steps. Ryan, I heard you got married, he said. Not accusatory, just Ryan. Straightforward the way he always was. Beverly mentioned it. I did. Are you okay? The question caught me in a way I wasn't prepared for, not because it was profound, but because the last few months had been so relentlessly practical, so focused on logistics and adjustments and learning how to live in a new life, that nobody had simply asked me whether I was okay. I'm managing, I said, which was the honest answer. Can we get coffee? He asked. Just to talk. Nothing. I'm not trying to start anything, Claire. I just want to see how you're doing. I should have said no. I know that now. At the time, I told myself it was harmless coffee with an old friend. A conversation, closure. I was lonely in a way that was hard to explain. Living with Marcus was better than I'd expected. But it was still quiet, still careful, still so much unspoken between us. I told Marcus I was meeting a girlfriend. That was the first lie I'd told him. It sat in my stomach like a stone. Ryan was already at the coffee shop when I arrived. He stood up when he saw me. He looked good. Colorado had agreed with him, apparently. We sat across from each other and ordered and talked about nothing important for a while. And then he looked at me over his coffee cup and said, Are you actually happy, Claire? I'm okay. That's not what I asked. I looked at my hands. It's complicated. Does he treat you well? Yes. That, at least, I could say without hesitation. But you didn't marry him for love. No. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I never stopped thinking about you. I want you to know that. And when I came back to Charlotte, my company opened an office here. I thought about whether things might be different. Ryan, I'm married to a man you didn't choose freely. That's not. I stopped. Because he wasn't entirely wrong, and we both knew it. He slid his phone number across the table on a napkin, the way people do in movies, which made me want to laugh a little in spite of everything. I'm not asking you to do anything, he said. I just want you to know I'm here. If you need a friend, or more than a friend, whatever you need. I took the napkin. I don't know why. Habit, maybe. Or the part of me that was still 25 and in love with the uncomplicated version of my life. I drove home with that napkin in my purse, and I walked into the house. And Marcus was in the living room reading, and he looked up and gave me the small nod he gave me when I came in, and I felt about 3 inches tall. Over the following week, Ryan texted, just short things, a song he thought I'd like, a question about how I was, a funny observation about Charlotte traffic. Nothing overtly inappropriate, just a presence. Just a reminder that there was a version of my life that had been simpler. And I was confused. I'm being honest with you. I was genuinely confused. Because I had started to feel something for Marcus that I couldn't quite name, yet not love. Not exactly, but something in that direction. A pull, an interest, a wanting to know what he was thinking and whether he was all right. And yet here was Ryan, representing everything familiar and easy, and I didn't know which feeling to trust. One evening, Marcus looked up from his book and said, "You seem like something's on your mind." I almost told him. Instead, I said, "Just tired." He watched me for a moment. "If I've done something to make you uncomfortable," he said, "I'd want to know." "You haven't," I said. "It's nothing to do with you." I met Ryan one more time. I told myself it would be the last time, that I was going to be clear with him and put this to rest. We met at a park near downtown. He had brought coffees from a place he remembered I liked. We sat on a bench under an oak tree, and he told me, without preamble, that he was still in love with me, that he had been for 3 years, that coming back to Charlotte was partly mostly because of me. "Claire," he said, "just tell me honestly, if things were different, if you didn't have this obligation, would you want to be with me?" And here's the truth I sat with in that park I didn't know. A month earlier, the answer might have been yes. But something had been happening in that quiet house, with that quiet man, and I wasn't sure the answer was yes anymore. What I knew was this Marcus had never once made me feel small. He had defended me to his family without being asked. He had paid attention to the small things, the half and half, the thermostat, the arrangement of the dishes in a way that said, "I see you, I'm paying attention, you matter here." And he had done all of it without ever asking for recognition or thanks. I thought about the night I'd stood in his doorway, watching him do push-ups in the dark, alone, counting to himself, refusing to quit. I put Ryan's coffee down on the bench beside me. "I can't do this," I said. "Claire." "I mean it, Ryan. I'm not saying this to protect myself from something I want. I'm saying it because I made a commitment, and because I stopped. Because what I wanted to say was because I think he's a better man than I've given him credit for, and I don't want to find out what I'm losing by walking away from it." I didn't say all of that. I just said because it's the right thing, and I need you to respect that. Ryan was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded. I drove home. I deleted his number from my phone. I sat at the kitchen table for a while, and when Marcus wheeled out to make himself a cup of tea, he stopped and looked at me. "Are you all right?" "Yes," I said, and this time I meant it. "I think I am." He made 2 cups of tea and set one in front of me without asking, and we sat at the kitchen table together in the early evening light, not talking much, just being in the same room. It was the most peaceful I had felt in weeks. I realized, sitting there, that I had made my decision. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. The house kept its secrets, as old houses do, and one of them revealed itself on a Saturday night in September, about 4 months into our marriage. I was in the kitchen finishing the dishes when I heard voices outside. Low voices, through the screen door that led to the back of the house. I didn't think much of it. The neighbors sometimes sat on their porch at night until I recognized Robert, Webb's voice, and heard something in his tone that made me go still. He was in the backyard, near the old storage shed, speaking to someone I didn't recognize. I moved closer to the screen door without going through it. "What's the square footage?" the stranger was asking. "The house, about 2,200. Lots bigger, close to 1/3 of an acre." Robert's voice. "In this neighborhood, I'm estimating it lists around 450, maybe 475. "And the son's name is on the deed?" "Yes." His mother left it to him outright, but he'd need to sign off on any sale. The thing is, he doesn't always see the big picture. He's been isolated out here. I could make a case that a smaller place would be better for him. Easier to manage, more accessible. I stood very still at that screen door. And the wife? The stranger asked. Oh, she'll go wherever the money goes, Robert said. She married him to pay off debt. Once the house is gone, she'll have no reason to stay. My hands were flat against the wall on either side of the doorframe. My breathing was very controlled. This was Marcus's house. His mother had left it to him, and his father was in the backyard pricing it out with a real estate agent, planning to talk his wheelchair-bound son into giving it up, banking on the assumption that I would disappear once it was gone. I went upstairs. I sat on my bed. I thought for a long time about what to do. By morning, I had decided. I found Marcus in the living room after breakfast. I sat down across from him, and I told him everything I had heard, word for word, as clearly and calmly as I could. I didn't editorialize. I just told him what his father had said. Marcus listened without interrupting. His expression didn't change much. It never changed much. But something around his eyes went very still in the way of someone absorbing a blow they had half expected. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's said things like this before, in different ways. You knew?" I suspected. He looked at his hands. He's never thought I was capable of managing my own life. It's easier for him to believe I need to be managed than to accept that I've been doing it myself for 3 years. What do you want to do? He looked at me directly, in the way he rarely did, in the way that meant he was deciding something. I want to protect my home, he said, and I want to do it correctly, with a lawyer. Good, I said. Let's do that. I don't know exactly when it happened, when his problem became our problem, when his house became our house in my mind. But it had happened quietly, the way everything between Marcus and me happened. We found a real estate attorney who specialized in property rights and family disputes. The news was good. Marcus's ownership was clear and uncontested. His father could not sell the property without Marcus's consent. Robert had no legal authority over the house, and never had. He had simply been hoping his son wouldn't push back. When we told Robert, in a meeting that Marcus insisted on having face-to-face, he blustered a bit. He talked about what was practical, what was best for Marcus, what Marcus didn't understand about the real world. Marcus let him finish. Then he said quietly, "This is my home, Dad. I'm keeping it. And if you'd like to continue being part of my life, I'd need you to accept that." Robert left in a temper. Patricia Shelton tried once more. A few weeks later, a phone call to me this time, not Marcus. She told me she knew what I was doing and that I wouldn't get away with it. "Patricia," I said, "I'm going to hang up now. If you want to have a real conversation with your nephew, I'd encourage you to call him directly." And I hung up. Marcus heard about it afterward. He didn't say much, but that evening he made dinner a thing he hadn't done before. And when I came downstairs, I found the table set for 2 and something that smelled extraordinary coming from the oven. "You cook?" I said. "When I have a reason to," he said. We ate together, and it was good, really good. A roast chicken with herbs that tasted like he'd been making it for years. And afterward, he looked at me across the table and said, "I'm glad you stayed. Not, I'm glad you're here because you had a contract. Not, I'm glad our arrangement is working out. Just I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad you stayed." I went to bed that night thinking about what it means to stay. How it's different from merely remaining. How staying is a choice you make, and keep making, every day. The months that followed were the quietest and most unexpectedly good months of my life. Marcus's condition wasn't getting worse. His doctors had told him it wasn't progressive, just permanent, which he treated as information rather than tragedy. He had adapted his life around it with a thoroughness that I found, the more I understood it, genuinely impressive. He worked as a freelance technical translator. He spoke 3 languages, which I hadn't known for weeks because it hadn't come up, and he did it well enough to support himself comfortably. He had a physical therapist who came twice a week, and an exercise routine he followed with the same quiet discipline I'd seen that first night in the dark. I went back to work at the salon. Beverly was pleased and unsurprised to see me. I picked up more hours. I started taking evening classes toward a cosmetology license. Marcus never once questioned why I wanted to. He just moved the kitchen table against the wall, so I'd have more room to study, and made sure the house was quiet on nights when I had reading to do. My mother moved to a rehabilitation facility after her hospital stay, and then, eventually, to an assisted living community that we paid for together, Marcus had insisted. She got a little better, not all the way, but enough. She met Marcus for the first time at Thanksgiving, when we brought dinner to her room, and she held his hand for a long time and said, "You take care of my girl." He said, "I'm working on it." She smiled at him. My mother had always been an excellent judge of character. One evening in December, almost exactly a year after I'd moved into that house, I was sitting on the back porch, watching the yard go dark, when Marcus wheeled out and parked beside me. We sat there for a while without talking. The street was quiet. The neighbors had their Christmas lights up. It was cold enough to need a jacket, but not cold enough to go in. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." "Are you happy?" It was his question to me from the beginning. It felt right to give it back. He thought about it. He always thought before he answered, which I had come to understand was not reluctance, but respect for the question, for me, for the truth. "Yes," he said. "I think I am, for the first time in a while." "Me too." We sat there a little longer. The Christmas lights blinked on and off down the block. I could hear a television through someone's window. "I know this wasn't what you planned," Marcus said. "Neither did you." "No?" he agreed. "But I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think sometimes the life you end up with is better than the one you planned, because you didn't plan it carefully enough to leave out all the things that matter." I didn't have a better way to say it than that. So I just said, "Yes, I think that's exactly right." He reached over and put his hand on the armrest of my chair, close to mine. Not quite touching, just close. I put my hand over his. We stayed like that until the cold sent us in. That was 1.5 years ago now. A great deal has happened since, some of it hard. Some of it better than I could have imagined. My mother is doing well. Marcus's father has become, slowly and reluctantly, somewhat more humble about his son's capabilities. Patricia still doesn't entirely like me, but she's stopped making it my problem. And Marcus and I have built something in that old creaky house that I don't have a perfect word for. Not the love story I would have written for myself at 25. Something more honest than that. Something that was tested early by desperation and judgment and the worst assumptions people make about other people's motives. Something that held. I used to feel ashamed of how it started. I used to brace myself when people asked how we met, waiting for the judgment, ready to minimize or deflect. I don't do that anymore, because here is what I know now that I didn't know. Then the beginning of a thing is not the whole of a thing. A person can start a chapter for the wrong reasons and find, somewhere in the middle, that the reasons have changed, that they've become something better. something chosen. Marcus taught me that. Not by lecturing me, not by asking anything of me, just by being steadily, quietly, completely himself. By counting to himself in the dark and refusing to stop. By moving the half and half to the front of the refrigerator. By setting a mug beside the teapot when he heard me come home sad. By saying, "I'm glad you stayed. I am glad I stayed." If you are in a season of your life where circumstances have made the choices for you, where you feel like you are living someone else's plan, surviving something you didn't design, I want you to hear this. The story is not over. The chapter you're in is not the last chapter. Sometimes what starts as a transaction becomes a partnership. Sometimes a stranger becomes the person who knows you best. Sometimes the life you ended up with, the one you didn't choose, the one you couldn't have imagined, turns out to be the truest one you've ever lived. Don't walk out the door at 2 in the morning. Go back to bed. Give it time.